evening and welcome to the special edition webinar on the implications of Brexit on the independent community pharmacy. I am Helga, and this evening we will work through the perceived implications of Brexit on pharmacy and try and gain an understanding of what government contingencies are already in place and how the MPA is and will continue to support you throughout this period. Joining me on this webinar are a number of MPA colleagues and experts in their field of work. We have Mr. Gareth Jones, Head of Corporate Affairs, with expert knowledge on all things medicine supply and FMD, and Mrs. Leyla Hannbeck, who's Director of Pharmacy at the MPA, who heads up the MPA Pharmacy Support Services. Also on the webinar are two of the country representatives, McAlister, Northern Ireland, and Janice, Oman from Scotland, who will be supporting me with a Q&A session at the end. Behind the scenes, I'm also supported by Simon Wells from the events team, who is on hand to answer any of your technical queries in regard to the transmission of this webinar. Welcome to all. Before we embark on this, slides are not moving. Before we embark on this special edition webinar, please allow me to take you through some housekeeping tips. This is a web-only service, that is, you must listen through your computer. If you have any problems, please use your mouse to click on the question mark in the top right-hand corner of the screen. If you have any problems with audio, if you can see the slides but can't hear any audio, then please click the status shown underneath the presenter's picture, as indicated with the red arrow. If it shows us connecting, then please click on the refresh button. If it shows us playing, then please check your volume level. If this isn't the problem, then please check in the background. Make sure you don't have any system messages awaiting action, such as Java updates. This is an interactive webinar, so we will invite you to submit any questions. Please write them as text questions in the question panel below. If there's anything technical, Simon will respond immediately. The rest will be answered at the end of the webinar. Right, we're all set for our housekeeping. So now, Brexit, the impact of Brexit on the independent community pharmacy. As we are all aware, this week the UK has formally asked the EU for an extension to Article 50. We are still to receive a formal response from the EU, but it appears that any extension granted may come with some strings attached. Hence, given that we are a week away from the originally set Brexit day, we thought it would still be prudent for us to broadcast this webinar and share what we know in order that you, our members, may be able to be somewhat prepared for whatever Brexit outcome. It's worth noting that in their published guidance, the UK government insists that leaving the EU with a deal remains the government's top priority and that this has not changed. They continue to add that as a responsible government must plan for every eventuality, including a no-deal scenario. Now, over the past year, the MPA convened a task and finish group comprising of leading experts from academia, pharma, and the community pharmacy sector in order to consider the implications of Brexit for independent community pharmacy and their patients. And it found that the impact of Brexit will impact 4 of the anchors that underpin the work and the role of community pharmacy. And these include, my slides are not working, Simon. I'm sorry, I just have a technical hitch. Oh, there we are. Thank you. Apologies, listeners. Go back. So the 4 anchors that might be impacted by Brexit include regulation, operational issues, workforce issues, and the NHS. Now, the medicine stock supply might be affected as a result of regulation and border controls. FMD and pharmacovigilance might be impacted due to a lack of access to the European database. And an impact on the workforce will be felt more acutely in the current hard-to-recruit areas. In short, it is anticipated that following the UK exit from the European Union, there could be potential disruption to the UK's medicine supply, reduced access to the EU regulatory and development frameworks, reduced access to qualified staff, and increased medicine prices. Over the past months, we at the MPA have been working very closely with colleagues from across the pharmacy sector, the DHSC, the NHS, and other stakeholders to ensure the continued supply of medicines and healthcare services in community pharmacy as the UK leaves the European Union. Various government agencies, such as the MHRA, have put forward a number of proposals in order to mitigate against some of this impact, and the number of proposals have now been inserted into legislation. These include serious shortage protocols, more of that later, recognition of professional qualifications, and recognition of prescriptions. I mentioned earlier that there will also be an impact on workforce, and in order to mitigate against this, the government has introduced an EU settlement scheme free of charge where EU nationals can now apply to continue living in the UK after the 30th of June 2021. An employer toolkit has also been launched to support you, the employers, and please visit the MPA Brexit webpage to a link to this. It is also anticipated that the regulatory bodies, the GPHC and PSNI in Northern Ireland, will continue to recognise these EEA nationals who have already registered in the UK. I will now outline some key updates from each of the home nations. Northern Ireland. Now, the impact of Brexit may be felt more pronounced in Northern Ireland due to its geography and its close proximity to the EU. And we, at the MPA, have been monitoring developments very closely in this sphere. Thus far, what we are aware of is that Ireland has recently passed the Omnibus Act, which allows people from the Republic to continue to obtain the pharmacy services from pharmacies in Northern Ireland. We have also submitted to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee inquiry on the EU withdrawal agreement and the backstop, listing the impact of Brexit that would be particular to our Northern Irish members. We're still waiting for the full outcome of this, but an interim report, including our submission, has been published. Moving on to Scotland, I mentioned earlier the EU settlement scheme, which is a UK-wide scheme. However, the Scottish Government will also be delivering an advice and support service specifically for citizens in Scotland. This will be done through Citizens Advice Scotland. Information on this is still to be coming, and so therefore continue visiting our MPA Brexit page or visit the relevant Government Scotland page for relevant information. There will also be some more details and further information for EU citizens living in Scotland in case of a no-deal Brexit. Coming back to England, we do have some specific published updated information from NHS England, who plans for continuity of supply of medicines in the case of a no-deal Brexit. They also include a statement to healthcare professionals, and they also include some supporting Q&As, which may be useful to discuss with patients. In Wales, the contingencies along Brexit are much aligned to the DHSC, but again, there's some specific support material for Welsh contractors on the CPW website, as well as government.wales website. Again, links for these are available through the MPA Brexit page. I will now invite Gareth Jones, to speak to us in detail about the mitigation and contingencies that are in place in regards to the medicine supply and FMD.
Thank you, Helga. So, the MPA and other pharmacy bodies have been talking to the Department of Health, NHS England, MHRA and GPHC for some time about the implications of Brexit and actions that can be undertaken. And when we think about the supply chain, it is recognised that Brexit is taking place at a time when the medicine supply chain is already under unprecedented pressure. So, why are we particularly concerned about the medicine supply chain? Well, it's believed that around about 75% of medicines that reach UK patients come from or via the EU. And the vast majority come in to the UK via the Calais to Dover Folkestone route. So the particular concern is about the flow from Calais to Dover and Folkestone and the risk that will be severely limited in the case of a no-deal Brexit. So, as I said, we've and others have been having discussions with the Department of Health for quite some time, and there are 5 parts really to the approach that the Department of Health is taking to try to reduce the risk of medicine shortages linked to Brexit. Now, medicines regulation is not itself devolved in the way that health care is. So the Department of Health does have some responsibility across the UK in this area. So the Department of Health has commented that they're confident that if everyone, including suppliers, freight companies, international partners, and the healthcare system itself, does what they need to do, supply of medicines and medicinal products should be uninterrupted in the event of exiting the EU without a deal. Having said that, they've also made it clear that they will not issue any guarantees. They can't issue any guarantees that no individual patients will remain unaffected by anything that might happen. So just to run then through these 5 areas of focus for the Department of Health. The first one is buffer stocks. So the Department of Health has analysed over 12,000 different medicine lines, and of those 7,000 prescription-only medicines and P medicines do touch the EU in some way. So, as has been fairly well publicised, the suppliers have been asked to hold an additional 6 weeks buffer stock and to have that in place for the 29th of March. Provisions are also in place for medical devices. So the NHS has placed additional orders, so the NHS itself has additional stock in place for medical devices. Blood, tissue and transplants, which is slightly less of an issue because most of that is coming from the UK anyway. Vaccinations, where there is also a stockpile for vaccines, and clinical trial supplies. There are also special arrangements for medical radioisotopes, for example, which have very short shelf lives, and extra air freight capacity has been arranged to ensure continuity of supply of radioisotopes. Second part of the Department of Health plan is additional warehouse space. Clearly, there isn't a lot of spare capacity in the system, so they've arranged for additional warehouse space to align with this request that manufacturers build up buffer stocks. There's also additional ferry capacity away from that Calais to Dover Folkestone route. So Department of Health has reserved tickets on ferries coming into Poole, Portsmouth, Plymouth and Felixstowe. So they've got alternative routes in should the main route from Calais to Dover and Folkestone be highly congested. There's also a little bit of work on the regulations. So some clarifications about regulations. So in the case of a no-deal Brexit, the UK will no longer be part of the European Medicines Agency. But what they said is that batch testing, for example, that's carried out in the EU will be sufficient for products to come into the UK. So I don't believe the EU itself will accept the opposite position. I don't think they're going to accept batch-tested products from the UK, but the UK government position is that if a batch has been tested within an current EU state, then it will still be accepted for use in the UK. So that regulatory flexibility again should allow more stocks to flow. And then the final part is the serious shortages protocol, which we'll come back to a few times actually, because that's an important development within the Brexit planning. And government's been clear that pharmacies, patients should not stockpile, and prescription ordering should happen in the same way. Now, there is a little bit of evidence of some stockpiling by patients, but certainly they're being asked not to stockpile. So I'm trying to talk or show a few slides now about the serious shortages protocol. I just explain how it's come into existence, and then Leyla will go into a little bit more detail after I've talked about it. So the regulations have been put before Parliament and adopted. So we do now have regulations in place to permit serious shortage protocols, and they will be issued by a minister when they believe that there is a shortage. Now, there's been a bit of opposition to these protocols. The BMA and RCGP, for example, have expressed concerns about therapeutic substitution, and patient representative bodies have complained about the lack of consultation, and they have particular concerns in areas like epilepsy. And I'm sure all pharmacists would obviously share their concerns about the use of these protocols in certain circumstances. But I think the consultation period was slow, and that has generated quite a few complaints and criticisms of these protocols. So there was an attempt in Parliament on Monday evening, actually, to overturn the regulations, but that was defeated. So these regulations are in place, and they are available for ministers to use. There's also been some activity in the courts. So a group called the Good Law Project went to the High Court to try to use a judicial review to revoke the regulations, but they have also been unsuccessful, although they are appealing again next week. And this certainly within pharmacy, I think we've supported these protocols, and the MPA and others put forward the idea of protocols, and we've supported them because we see them as a way of giving pharmacists flexibility to help patients and reduce the burden on GPs as well. And I suppose just as some of the background to the shortage protocol is the situation with EpiPen towards the latter part of last year. I'm sure everyone's aware of the EpiPen shortage, and the Department of Health used an ad hoc arrangement asking pharmacists to ration stock and talk to patients to ascertain whether they really needed stock. Well, this serious shortage protocol is a more formal approach to dealing with that sort of situation where we may not have enough stock in the country and there's a need to look after what stock we have. So the regulation allows different strength, quantity or form, and therapeutic substitution. We're much more likely to see the former than the latter. So therapeutic substitution, I think, won't be used very often, but that power does exist. And some of the concerns that actually have been expressed about the protocol is the fact that not every pharmacist has full access to electronic care records, and if there's a therapeutic substitution, there may be information that you don't have access to that you would really need to have for that to happen. It's worth pointing out that the serious shortage protocol is not specifically linked to Brexit. It's a regulation that is now in place, regardless of what happens with Brexit. It'll only be issued in exceptional circumstances, and the Minister will take advice from clinicians before issuing a serious shortage protocol. Reimbursement arrangements still not agreed. Communication protocols with GPs still to be agreed. And the regulations will be reviewed in a year. Because of the short consultation process, there will be a retrospective review of these protocols to ensure that the regulation is being applied appropriately. And of course, pharmacists are not obliged to use these protocols. They can use their clinical judgment to not use them and send the patient back to a GP. So Department of Health is also strengthening procedures for dealing with medicine shortages. So the team that deals with shortages in the Department of Health has increased significantly in size in recent months. NHS England has established additional mechanisms for capturing information on shortages. And this is cross-checked against information they already receive from wholesalers and manufacturers. The pharmacy organisations have been working together to liaise with Department of Health, MHRA, GPHC and others, and the pharmacy bodies put out a joint statement on medicine supply just a couple of weeks ago to make the point that we have been working together and with government on this, on mechanisms to mitigate the risks that we have identified. Now, I'm just going to touch also on the EU Falsified Medicines Directive. This came into UK law on the 9th of February. Now, the government's Brexit strategy has been that post-Brexit, they would like the UK to stay within the European Medicines Regulation System, and FMD is a key part of the Medicines Regulation System, and therefore government desire is that we stay within FMD. However, if there is a no-deal Brexit, we drop out of a lot of the EU regulations, and that includes the FMD requirements. So in the case of a no-deal Brexit, the regulations relating to FMD will be revoked, and the requirement to authenticate products will disappear overnight on the day of a no-deal Brexit. So our advice on FMD for quite some time has been not to tie yourself into long-term contracts with IT providers because of this risk of FMD being revoked because of a no-deal Brexit. In the long term, though, we would expect that there would be some counterfeit medicine system in the UK. So if there is a no-deal Brexit and the UK is not given access to the EU FMD system, it's highly likely that the government would introduce a UK-based system. That's very unlikely in the short term, though. There would be a gap, certainly, in any obligations relating to counterfeit medicines. I also want to pick up briefly recognition of prescriptions. So UK currently recognises all EU and EEA prescriptions, but following Brexit, recognition will be based on an approved list which includes all current EU and EEA countries. So essentially, there will be no change. Those prescriptions can still be dispensed in the UK, and as per now, these prescriptions will be dispensed as private prescriptions at no cost to the NHS. So my final point is to highlight the advice that government is giving to patients in relation to medicines. That is that repeat prescriptions should be requested as normal. So patients are being asked not to overorder. Patients are being reassured that there is an additional buffer of 6-week stock in the supply chain in the UK. Medicines will be prioritised at the ports for import, so medicines should be coming in ahead of all other products. And also that temporary shortages have always occurred, and the system is actually used to dealing with shortages. They are a huge burden for pharmacists, but generally speaking, the burden to patients is minimised by the activity of a pharmacist, and that should carry on. And finally, the advice to patients is, if you're concerned, speak to your doctor or pharmacist. Okay, well, I'm now going to hand over to Leyla for the next part.
Thank you, Gareth, for a very comprehensive presentation on medicine supply. If I could, while we're doing the changeover here, invite members to continue to submit their questions to the webinar portal, where Gareth and other guests, including Leyla, will be able to answer your questions at the end of that. I can see a couple of questions, but please continue feeding them in as we speak. I will now invite Ms. Leyla Hannbeck to speak to us about what MPA support materials and resources are and will be made available. Thank you, Leyla.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So my colleagues covered the Brexit in terms of what we're going through at the moment and the situation and the shortages. And Gareth did talk about the serious shortages protocol. There's been obviously a lot of talks about it, and particularly in relation to the generic substitution of medicines. And pharmacy media and other media have actually picked up on it, and there are mixed messages and mixed feelings going around in relation to generic substitution. So what does it mean, really? Generic substitution, I jumped slides, sorry. Generic substitution is really what Department of Health is trying to do in relation to changes to the regulations of 2012 to ensure that medicine supply continues in the event of issues in relation to Brexit. And for that, they will be writing a protocol of medicines, experiencing a shortage. And that protocol is something that pharmacists would then need to follow when they come to put this into action. What we need to remember is that some medicines obviously require brand specificity, and so they need to maintain therapeutic efficacy. And so not every medicine will be suitable for use when it comes to this particular protocol. So we will be keeping an eye on this, and as soon as we have all the information required, we will be publishing support for our contractors in relation to what to do and what it means for them. Unsuitable medicines are, for example, drugs for epilepsy, biosimilar or brand-prescribed medicines, those medicines that are with narrow therapeutic index, modified release preparations, and there's a list of them that Department of Health will obviously take into account when they prepare the protocol, and they are liaising with relevant experts to make sure that it's completely, covering all the areas that it needs to be covering. Some of the concerns that we've received from pharmacists in relation to the shortage protocol is in relation to indemnity insurance. So, for example, what will happen to me if I do something and something happens to the patient, and will I be taking the full accountability and so on? First of all, I want to make sure that everyone understands that there is a protocol. That means that there are step-by-step advice in terms of what the pharmacist should be doing. And so if pharmacists are following that protocol, there's no need to be really worried about it. So from an indemnity insurance perspective, at the moment, what we are saying is that as long as you follow the protocol and as long as you have the right standard operating procedures in place and so on, you will be covered, and there's no need to worry around that. Of course, we will be monitoring the whole situation in terms of what is expected of pharmacists, and will advise pharmacists accordingly. Some of the questions and answers that we regularly receive from pharmacists is around, for example, will the shortages protocol apply to all areas within the UK? The answer to that is yes. The SSP will specify which UK region it's applicable to, and throughout all of the UK, a particular UK country, or a particular area or region within the UK country. So the protocol will set that out. Will the shortages protocol have an expiry? Well, the SSP will clearly say what time period is valid for. It's like a set of SOPs in terms of what to do and what to not do, and what to look out for and so on. So you will need to make sure that you follow this and check the protocol for any alerts in terms of if there are any changes and so on. How is an SSP introduced? The department receives regular reports on medicine shortages, and they assess the risk to patients, and they will be obviously using various different methods to, that have been exhausted or are ineffective. Obviously, they will just make sure that the protocol is focused on those areas that are basically ineffective, and they can fix that. So the department will liaise with all manufacturers or marketing authorization holders, and collaborate with all other healthcare bodies and pharmacy bodies and various different experts and clinicians that obviously will provide expertise before this is actually introduced. How to deal with shortages. At the moment, obviously, we are getting quite a lot of people, a lot of pharmacists contacting the MPA, worried about the shortages. Even members of the public are contacting us, telling us that, or, what am I going to do with my medicines? And, I haven't been receiving my medicines. What do I need to do? So there are loads of resources available through the MPA in terms of what to do. We, on a monthly basis, produce a shortages list by calling all manufacturers to make sure that we've got an update on stock availability, and if a manufacturer is run short of something, what the alternatives are and where you can get that from. So it's a good thing to keep an eye on in terms of what to do when a medicine is on the short list. We've also become aware that some CCGs are sending pharmacists some letters in terms of asking for them to put out their statements of readiness. And so for that, we've developed templates that pharmacy contractors can print and tailor to meet the needs of the business and submit to the CCG if they're being asked to provide a statement of readiness. We've got GP notification templates in relation to medicine shortages that you can print out and fill in and send to your GP. You can also fill that online. We've got patient information templates that you can print out and give to patients so that they are aware of what is happening, and also give them an opportunity to understand that you're doing absolutely everything for them in relation to getting the medicines. And we've got pharmacy posters that again you can print and put on in your pharmacy to make sure that patients are aware of what is going on. This is an example of our template in relation to statement of readiness that some CCGs have asked for. And so as you can see, you can just insert the name of the CCG or whoever the person is and your name of the pharmacy and so on, and just send it over to the right person. This is a template in relation to GP notification of medicine shortages. A lot of pharmacists find this very useful, and GPs find this very useful, so that they receive the name of the patient and what is short and what needs to be happening there. This is a template in relation to patient information when it comes to medicine shortages that you can fill in and hand over to a patient or put on display somewhere. And this is the poster that I was talking about in relation to printing it and putting it in your pharmacy to highlight that that some medicines are in short supply. For any further information, obviously myself and my team are available to take any inquiries from you. If you become aware of what is going on in your local area in relation to Brexit or medicine shortages or what your CCGs or local authorities are asking, please do get in touch and let us know so that we can help you send the relevant templates or information requested. Thank you very much. I will hand over to Helga now.
Leyla and Gareth for giving us a nice little summary of what is happening with all things Brexit, connecting with community pharmacy, and also resources and support that we have available for our members. We will now go to some questions, to your questions. Assisting me in answering them will be Gareth, Leyla, and Janice. And I have a question here, actually, for Leyla, if I can start with you in the first instance. And it will be, how will I know when an SSP has been issued?
Department of Health will make us aware that this has been issued, and so we're keeping an eye on this to make sure that contractors are aware of it and what it entails and what you need to be doing as part of the process. What I would recommend as well is that pharmacy staff are aware of this as well. So if patients ask your team members about the serious shortages protocol, that your team know that what to answer and how to liaise with the pharmacist and so on. So all the information in relation to serious shortage protocol will be communicated. As soon as we have relevant information, we will be communicating it to you.
Thank you, Leyla. And I suppose, talking about serious shortages, are they expected, even the case of a deal being made? Who would like to take that question, Leyla or Gareth?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that one. I think, it's so difficult to directly link shortages to Brexit, and we know there are shortages in the market at the moment. And I think the uncertainty in the supply chain could certainly contribute to shortages, whether there is a deal or not. So I think we can't rule out the fact that even if there is a deal next week or a deal later on, and we don't have a no-deal situation, that there won't be any problems because the supply chain is having to second-guess really what's happening in the UK. So I can't give any certain answer on that one, I'm afraid. But yeah, it's certainly a risk that there would still be shortages.
Thank you. Thank you, Gareth. We now have a question from Scotland, from Mrs. MacDonald, from MacDonald Pharmacy. And we understand, Janice, that currently there is a service up in Scotland known as unscheduled care, PGDs. Will pharmacists be covered if they use unscheduled care PGD to substitute unavailable medicines?
Yes, Helga, the unscheduled care PGD, it has been around for a good many years now in Scotland and gets updated every year or so. And the latest version is quite clear that it enables the pharmacist to substitute different formulation types of medicines in the event of the prescribed form being unavailable or unsuitable. The PGD, the unscheduled care PGD, was kind of originally brought in to be used in out of hours, but actually now it can be used when the doctor is unavailable, and it suggests that it's perhaps useful to discuss with your local surgeries on the use of the PGD. But it has been used routinely for such a long while in Scotland, so it is there, and it perhaps gives an extra tool to manage patients getting their medicines that they require. Yes, they will definitely be covered following the PGD. The indemnity, professional indemnity, and the NPA are very aware of the unscheduled care PGD, which has worked very well for a long while, and if people follow the PGD, they will undoubtedly be covered by their indemnity insurance.
Great, thank you. That's a bit reassuring for our Scottish members, for sure. We do have a question from Mrs. Murphy in Northern Ireland here. Anne, if you can help us with that. We mentioned earlier the Omnibus Act that the Republic of Ireland has passed. So will EU and EEA prescriptions continue to be recognised if in the UK there's a hard Brexit? Actually, it could be open to everybody. But Anne, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Helga. Yes, currently, and as Gareth had stated earlier, EEA and EU prescriptions will be recognised. I suppose it applies specifically to Northern Ireland, where there is quite a bit of cross-border trade with prescriptions, and they will continue to be recognised, treated as private prescriptions. There is some cross-border joint health care where patients are seen under the general medical scheme. Patients from Southern Ireland can access their health care in Northern Ireland. And again, the Omnibus bill that you referred to earlier from Southern Ireland has put some protection around the access that those patients can gain.
Okay, thank you. We have an FMD question, Gareth, and the question comes from a Mr. Modi, and if an extension is not granted, how is FMD implemented if we leave with no deal?
Yeah, if we leave with no deal, the regulatory requirements on pharmacy effectively disappear overnight. So we won't have any obligation the day after Brexit to scan or check the tamper evidence. What happens in the long term is not clear, although, as I mentioned a bit earlier on, I think most people think there will be a new UK system for to try to stop counterfeit medicines getting into the supply chain. This is ultimately about about ensuring that patients don't get exposed to counterfeit medicines. There is a question about all the costs that pharmacy has incurred already, and in fact, people in Northern Ireland really are the only ones who've got any funding thus far for FND, but I'm sure the other negotiating bodies that are currently negotiating for FND funding would certainly be asking for funding for the cost of pharmacy engaging with the system, even if it was only for a few months.
Okay. Leyla, you mentioned the serious shortage protocol. You will be aware in this week's parliamentary debate on the human medicines regulations, where MPs argued that pharmacists do not have the necessary skills to be trusted with new emergency medicine shortages powers. Have you got any comments or advice for our members? Should they be challenged in that way by their patients?
Helga, I knew that question would come up. So, yes, my view, and based on obviously what we have been reading, is that obviously as pharmacists we've got 5 years studies in relation to medicine. So we specifically study medicines and you know what they do in the body and everything. And so a lot of us are currently involved on actually advising our GP colleagues in relation to various different substitutions when it comes to medicines, and many of us work very, very closely with GP colleagues on that. And let me just be very clear that in regards to the serious shortages protocol, we're talking about a protocol here, which means that there's going to be set up advice and SOPs in relation to how to go about in a situation. And so it's not just something that pharmacists are going to be making up as they go. And we work in the best interest of the patient, and where is required, we're going to be liaising with our GP colleagues. And so I want people to rest assured that we've got the right skill set, we've got a protocol that we will be following, and we will be working in the best interest of patients. So it kind of makes me sad that this sort of comments have been made, but yeah.
Thank you, Leyla. Gareth, was there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just to add on that, and I think we in pharmacy and these protocols have been caught up in the crossfire of the politics around Brexit and the approach the Department of Health took to consulting and various bodies feeling that they weren't fairly consulted about these shortage protocols. So I think the vast majority of MPs do respect and appreciate the work of community pharmacists, and I think we shouldn't be too disheartened by one or two individuals making very negative comments, because I think parliamentarians in general recognise all the wonderful things that community pharmacy does for their constituents.
Actually, as you're there, Gareth, we've just had another question, this time from Mr. Jenkins in Wales, and he asked, what will the UK's relationship with EMA be in the event of a hard Brexit?
So the European Medicines Agency has already moved to Amsterdam. So it has been based in London since it was formed, and it's left the UK to move to Amsterdam. The UK won't be part of the European Medicines Agency because of if there is a case of a no-deal Brexit, and that means there could be delays to the regulation of new medicines. We won't get access to patient safety information, for example, that's currently shared. So if there are side effects reported in other European countries, all that information is fed into a database, which is then accessible to the UK regulators and forms information that we can all access about medicine. So, quite a number of issues coming out of the UK not having access to the European Medicines Agency.
Thank you, Gary. That was a bit of a tricky question in many regards. Now, we do have a question around, I suppose, any of the devolved nations, because health is devolved. So if I'll go to Janice in the first place, what are Scottish Parliament doing about the Brexit changes in particular?
Scottish Parliament were very early with doing an inquiry into the impacts of Brexit for health and social care, very early 2018. We responded to that on behalf of our members and took consultation with our members on that, as did other Scottish pharmacy organisations. So they were fairly well informed in looking at the areas that could be covered. As to now, as the changes are coming through, Scottish Parliament are getting notified of the statutory instruments as they come through Westminster. They then contact the Health and Sport Committee, who are then look at each one in individual basis and decide, are they content for UK ministers to deal with that, or is there anything there that's specific to Scotland having to deal with? So in most cases, they're giving consent for UK ministers on its behalf to deal with each instrument coming through. So they're keeping a very close eye, but most of it's going through Westminster.
Thank you. I guess the same might be the case in Northern Ireland, Anne. Is that the case?
Yes, Helga. Our Department of Health are working very closely with the other UK administrations just to make sure that medicine supply to patients is protected, but also the wider issues and the impact on workforce are also addressed. They've recently written to all pharmacists to provide reassurance of the work that's been undertaken at a Northern Ireland civil service level, of which the Department of Health feeds into. But the work very much mirrors that across the rest of the UK, and there's a watching brief being kept on it.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you. And obviously, you are all doing grand work, monitoring and keeping an eye across the UK, making sure that we've all got contingencies and support to our members. We do have one question here with regards to new drugs being approved by the EMA. Gareth, I was wondering if you can help me answer that. And the question is, in the case of a no-deal Brexit, with new drugs being approved by the EMA, which you said has just moved over to the Netherlands, would not be available in the UK? Or if so, what's going to happen as a result of that? Are we going to be short of new drugs?
I think I'll probably just build on the answer I gave a minute or two ago, really. And it's a very good question, referring to clinical trials and how that will be affected. I can't really say much more than I said before, really, that losing access to the EMA will have implications. Now, the MHRA is preparing for this, and it's scaled up as well to deal with much more work with the MHRA being a separate regulator. But yes, there certainly will be implications in areas like clinical trials. I think that's all I can say about that one.
Thank you very much, Gareth. And I would like to thank all our speakers and our guests, Janice and Anne, who have helped us navigate through what could be a very, very complex subject. But this is obviously not the end of our Brexit conversation, so continue sending any queries you might have with regard to resources, etc., to pharmacy services, all other questions to the Independence Voice at mpa.co.uk. May I also take this opportunity to also invite you to respond to the survey that will be available to you as soon as we end this transmission. But thank you all for your attention. Thank you to Simon, who has helped us with all the technical hitches we have had. Of course, it's went out very swimmingly well. And I wish you all well, and good night from the MPA.